Castle Howard is a Baroque landscape laid out in Hawardian hills with some Victorian interventions and I guess a certain amount of natural growth over the years. So some parts of the original design, the 18th century design, have been lost or become overgrown, and other parts preserved. And of course there's been a certain amount of sort of garden design over the last few centuries. I think what people appreciate is that contrast between designed landscape and then apparently undesigned, the sort of ornamental and the agricultural, and then kind of alternations between distant views and then kind of more intimate spaces, and then specific garden spectacles such as our Atlas Fountain or the walls of the walled garden or the follies. Yeah, predominantly they're native trees, plants and animals, with some introductions. Obviously any designed landscape will have, well, things like this cedar in it. This is not from the UK. So over the centuries there's been certain ornamental plantings, and some of these species are exotic. So we've got, well, around us we've got cedars and camellias. Camellias, of course, from Asia. But I guess predominantly we've got native species. Most of the woods are native species. We have collections, ornamental collections in the walled garden, so roses, you know, your usual stately home design garden, I guess, in some ways. And then we've got a unique rhododendron collection over in Raywood. So it's a mixture, really, of natives and exotics. So there have been declines in all sorts of things. This area was quite well botanised in the 19th century. We were fortunate enough to have had some quite famous Victorian explorers living in the area, and so we know parts of the estate were quite well botanised right into the mid-1800s. So for instance, there's the pyramid over there, and which is a 18th century monument, but we know that growing there in the 19th century there was the purple milk vetch, which is now a nationally very rare plant, and certainly nobody's seen it at Castle Howard for some time. So we know there's been a lot lost. There are a number of waterways and pools, fountains, cascades, that sort of thing in the estate. And we, last winter for instance, we spent some time uncovering the banks of New River, which is over towards the south-east of the design landscape. I mean, for the last 20 years, well, it was restored in the late 80s and early 90s, but for some reason over the last 20 years it's been allowed to become overgrown again. So we spent some time restoring those particular views. So sort of from this part of the estate you can look across the South Lake towards what we call New River, which is not really a river, it's a sort of a widened stream designed to look like a river. And there you can see the 18th century New River Bridge, the mausoleum, and really set against the wild sort of landscape. And I say wild, but it's really agricultural. So, but it's pretty rugged. So yeah, we have more to do on that this winter, and hopefully it will be a pretty pretty coherent by this time next year. This year, where we're standing now, in fact, these lawns have long been kept short as part of the kind of the lawns of the estate. But this year, really, is Mr. and Mrs. Howard's idea. We let them grow long, and what we found is actually there are remnant populations of wildflowers here. Not so much exactly where we're standing, because this area has been treated more as a more formal lawn, but over on those banks over there, recently ploughed by a badger. We have found remnant populations of quite a wide variety of things, to the point that you know, if you were sowing this fresh as a wildflower meadow, you'd have quite a good, or you'd be quite pleased with the results. So what we plan to do is allow this to happen every year and treat it basically as a sort of traditional kind of perennial hay meadow. So we'll introduce yellow rattle, which isn't present here anymore. It's an annual, so it disappears very quickly. But we will try and establish that, and then that will inhibit the grasses, which are very aggressive, but also allow the perennials. So your Yorkshire daisy. We've got a lot of devil's. What is it called? Devil's hawkbit? No, it's a successor anyway, sort of scabious. And harebell, and hopefully these will then spread. So what we're looking for is a kind of nice late summer kind of haze of purple through the grasses. In so doing, what we should then encourage are some of the native butterflies. So the meadow brown, for instance, is apparently present all year as a caterpillar. It doesn't have this sort of annual cycle in the same way that things that are more affected by the growing season do. But hopefully we will then see an uplift in the numbers of those sorts of butterflies. So we are reverting to some sort of essentially wildflower encouragement program, basically through traditional management. As far as rare animals go, well, I know we've got great crested newts. You do encounter those around in often the most unlikely places, and obviously they're protected, so you can't handle them. So I haven't seen so many this year, actually, I'll admit, but in previous years there's been a lot. You do wonder how they get to where they get to, but being so small. So I don't think there's anything particularly iconic. There's a lot here. That's the thing. I mean, I'm from Hertfordshire, and over my lifetime I had witnessed a decline in particularly bird species, I'd say. And then moving up here a few years ago, I was suddenly aware that there was a lot here. So I think the most important thing is to protect what's here, because I don't see why this part of North Yorkshire won't follow places like Hertfordshire. What I think has caused that in places like Hertfordshire is a change in agricultural practice, and then population pressure. I mean, people come, they want to make things tidy. I think there's less interest in gardening, sadly, than there was a generation or two ago. Hopefully that will have changed over lockdown, because it's one of the ways that people can very easily engage with nature, and then it makes you more aware of what's going on out there. I mean, you sort of start to notice the difference between insects. They're not just flies or beetles. You might notice a lacewing, for instance, and realise that its larvae, or discover that its larvae eat aphids, which is useful from a gardener's point of view. But then at the same time, it's kind of helping you in the garden context. So gardening is really positive that way. And there are ways to garden which are more nature friendly. We all want to try avoiding using chemicals. To avoid using chemicals, it's not terribly nice for the user, and it can be very damaging. There are, of course, times when you need to, in much the way that none of us want to live in a filthy house. We use chemicals in houses all the time, but if we can use nicer chemicals and only use them when we absolutely have to, then that's a better way of going about things. So gardening is, I think, really important for people. Managing the landscape is gardening. I spoke to a local farmer earlier this year, and I was learning about his old meadows, and I was saying, well, I was asking him to explain things to me, and because I said, I'm just a gardener, I don't know what you're doing in this, and he said, well, actually, this is just gardening on a grand scale. So managing the landscape is sort of gardening, and if we can manage it, and rather than going for these sort of perfect green lawns, we can encourage other things, perennials living amongst the turf, amongst the grass species, then that's better for pollinators. There are an awful lot of wildflowers that can live in short grass. The flower I mentioned earlier over by the pyramid, which is I'm walking towards, Astragalus danicus is a short turf specialist, so it survives in close crop turf. It can't survive in long grass. So there are species that specialise in managed ground, or I suppose grazed ground, and I mean the sheep is essentially a lawnmower. So gardening puts you in touch with these things in your own territory, if you like, your own garden or else a community garden or whatever. But then these principles help you understand the landscape around you better. Everything around you looks the way it does because we manage it. You know, if you left it alone, it would revert to scrub very, very quickly. And this is a cultural landscape, if you like, so there's, well, in my opinion, a great value in it. When Mr. and Mrs. Howard hired me, one of their chief concerns was the preservation of the landscape, the historic landscape. And it's something I feel quite strongly about too. So we have sought to concentrate on areas, I suppose, closest to the castle itself in the short term. And really what we've been doing is a sort of a lot of scrub clearance in very specific areas to open those historic views back up. If you start losing your views, then you lose, I guess, the content of the landscape, this sort of historic relevance. So yeah, well, I think the curator would be able to tell you more about the pyramid than I can, but I do know it is a monument to one of the 3rd Earl of Carlisle's ancestors, who secured a lot of lands in the north through a rather, what we might consider slightly scandalous series of marriages. Anyway, within there's a chamber inside with a bust of this ancestor carved to sort of commemorate him. And I mean, the reason I brought it up was because there was a local botanist called Richard Spruce, who was born, I think, in Ganthorpe and ended his days in Conisthorpe, which is the village on the other side of the Castle Howard Lake. And he was a keen botanist, and he studied particularly mosses and liverworts, which are very, very kind of humble plants, or in the plant kingdom anyway. He contributed towards Henry Baines' Flora of Yorkshire in the 1840s. Henry Baines was responsible for enhancing the York Museum gardens, actually, putting hot houses in and adding many plants. And he published this Flora of Yorkshire, and it's there that this plant, Astragalus danicus, was recorded. And I know a local ecologist, Alistair Fitter, who used to be involved with the Yorkshire Arboretum. He went over there some years ago to see if you could find this plant, and of course it's long since been gone. It would be lovely to have it back. I mean, it's a short turf specialist on chalky ground, so you know the ground hasn't changed, and maybe one day we'll get it back. Nice to think it's somewhere there in the soil profile, or maybe we can introduce seed. But it's rare nationally now. It used to be more common. So yeah, I guess this whole area once would have been pretty wildflower rich, but farming over the 20th century has not been good for wildflowers and insects, as we all know. So yeah, but it's one of our many follies, so something that people in the house are seeking to preserve and restore. Astragalus danicus is more commonly known as purple milk vetch, and it's a tiny little thing and very pretty, or at least that's what I see on Google, having never seen it in the flesh myself.